All right. This is my podcast. I'm going to be talking about socialist stuff. This is Taste the Robot. Today I'm going to be talking about, well, frickin' Latin America. Socialism in Latin America, capitalist intervention in Latin America. Today I'm going to be mostly talking about Guatemala, but I'm going to give a short introduction with just the whole Latin American shit. Anybody defending socialism should look to Latin America when analyzing the conditions faced by socialist and even mere social democratic regimes in which the capitalist mode remains, but social reforms such as government funded healthcare are brought in. There have been seemingly innumerable interferences in Latin America by the United States. These interferences were in accordance to the Truman Doctrine, which was implemented with intentions of countering any sort of Soviet expansion. Another activity the government took against socialism, discovered, researched, and released by iconic Watergate journalist and Pulitzer Prize winner Carl Bernstein in 1977, was the CIA's Operation Mockingbird, in which news outlets were infiltrated such as the New York Times, CBS, Time Magazine, Life Magazine, New York Herald Tribune, and Copley News Services. This was posted by Bernstein and the Rolling Stone in 2018. The intent of the operation was to spread anti-communist disinformation and pro-United States propaganda, and this action was started by Frank Wisner, I don't know how you pronounce it. As many as 400 journalists, including Pulitzer Prize winners, participated in this covert action, according to Bernstein. Many times, the head of these companies were unaware of such involvement, so the idea of the United States intervening in these countries with remotely socialist reforms should make plenty of sense. It's the means the United States went to intervene, which might come off as surprising to people. The Monroe Doctrine may have had, or the Truman Doctrine may have had influence at times as well. These policies, it's the Truman Doctrine that was enacted, by Truman, of course, just very recently. That was against Soviet expansion. The Monroe Doctrine, that was a long-ass time ago. These policies, at least two of them, lead to many instances where legitimate democratic springs were suppressed due to strive toward economic justice. To start out the analysis of U.S. invasions of Latin America, Guatemala will be a good place to start. The U.S. had a bone to pick with Guatemala in the early 1950s, and Jacobo Arbenz won the election in 1951 and was implementing a policy of land reform. After finding this out, the CIA carried out Operation Success, a performance of international covert action almost completely declassified by the CIA itself. And the land being reformed included some unused land by United Fruit, an American company based largely in Latin America. Their land was being nationalized because this land wasn't being cultivated and was left untouched for many years. More antagonisms were their refusal to cooperate with Guatemalan rule of law in terms of labor rights, and their failure to report most of its land and its taxes, according to historian Nicholas Colither, and he worked for the CIA, so he's pretty trustworthy. United Fruit, after this decision, turned to the U.S. government. This came naturally because the company was so grossly intertwined with the government. A former director of United Fruit, Thomas Dudley Cabot, was the current director of International Security Affairs. Alan Dulles, CIA director, and John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, did legal work for the company. They both did. Alan also owned a large share of United Fruit. Many others are named by journalist and academic Stephen Kinzer in his 2007 book, Overthrow, America's Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Iraq, Times Books. His previous work on Guatemala has been published by Harvard University Press, if that gives the title journalist any more credibility. United Fruit, turning to the United States, spurred a large-scale campaign, like I said, Operation Success, to either get President Arbenz to stop his plans to nationalize or to stop him altogether as a leader, like overthrow him. Secretary Dulles had, quote, convictions, according to Joel Whitney, that Guatemala had Soviet ties, considering Arbenz's Marxist attitude. The thing here is, there have never been any such ties discovered. Not when Dulles was secretary, and not now, according to Whitney. This is a quote from, Whitney. While hostility and pressure were mounted, Arbenz sought to stockpile weapons to protect his nation. 8 years prior to the nationalization of United Fruit's lands, after Guatemalans had ousted the repressive Ubico, the United States had cut off arms to Guatemala. As new pressure mounted in the wake of the land reform, the United States also blocked other would-be weapons suppliers from selling to Arbenz. There was no democratic rationale for the embargo. At the time, even Secretary Dulles admitted that it was impossible to produce evidence clearly tying the Guatemalan government to Moscow. When U.S. planes bombarded the nation with propaganda pamphlets, Arbenz ordered second-rate material from Czechoslovakia. When the ship carrying these Czech weapons, the Alfhelm, was intercepted, the United States depicted these purchases as sponsored by Moscow. Just, for fuck's sake. But if they had been sponsored by Moscow, Arbenz would have gotten these weapons for free. He didn't. Even Alan Dulles arranged a dinner with his friend, Julius Adler, the business manager of the Times, and complained. Adler passed the complaint on to Times publisher Arthur Hayes Sulzberger. A few days later, Grusson's boss pulled him out of Guatemala. But Grusson at the New York Times wasn't the only figure who saw clearly that a distorted reading of events was about to congeal into policy. The CIA's Guatemala station chief, Birch O'Neill, was yanked from the country when he raised questions about the wisdom or necessity of the agency's Operation Success. Indeed, as the New York Times veteran Stephen Kinzer has written, Dulles was right about the poor evidence of a tie between Guatemala and Moscow. While Arbenz was certainly enthralled with Marxist ideas, quote, there was no evidence ever emerged to support, end quote, Dulles' conviction that the Soviets were behind Guatemala's nationalism during Arbenz's incumbency. Quote, not in the vast archive of files the CIA captured after its coup, nor in any other document or testimony that has surfaced since, end quote. Quote from Whitney again. Yet when the media mogul Henry Luce's writers at Time magazine took a position, quote, sympathetic to Arbenz, end quote, their articles, quote, were written at the magazine's editorial offices in New York to take a hard line against the Guatemalan government, end quote. Whitney, 157, 158. Kinzer, Overthrow, page 136. Page 140, and page 136 again. Thomas's Very Best Men, page 117. Henry Luce being a part of the CIA's Operation Mockingbird would explain the fact. The stories for Time magazine were rewritten to oppose Guatemala. And that's according to Bernstein, the guy who broke Watergate. Whitney cites Kinzer saying radio broadcast by Voice of Liberation, which are actually a front created by the CIA and operated by David Adley Phillips. and he's well documented in the CIA website. You can look him up. There's a bunch of files on him. He, quote, helped foster the impression of a massive homegrown force, according to Whitney and Kinzer. Whitney, page 159, Kinzer, page 142. Quote from Holland, page 130, or Holland, page 305. At one time, an aspiring actor, David Atlee Phillips, was fluent in Spanish and fresh from working under contract to the CIA during Operation Success. Under the pseudonym Paul D. Langevin, Phillips had been the agency's chief liaison and advisor to La Voz de la Liberación, one of the most effective tools in the psychological warfare waged against Arbenz. End quote. The transcripts of Radio Liberation, also known as Sherwood Radio broadcast by the CIA website, can be accessed upon request to the CIA, as I've found out through talking to a lady on the phone. But they couldn't be obtained by me because there was a government shutdown for, a long-ass time, 35 days. That was kind of fucked up. But you can call their number and request shit. I'll post that in the description, maybe. The New York Times went as far to apologize for the Guatemalan coup in, 2011. Stephen Strader, associate professor of history at the McMaster University, gives an interesting take on the Guatemala United Fruit situation. He takes views from all sorts of historians, including realists, who see Arbenz as a Soviet, quote, puppet. Historical revisionists say there were many moves made that resembled economic imperialism in the Third World and were shaded by Cold War propaganda, specifically that of Operation Success. And lastly, he cites post-revisionists, who agree with the revisionists in the sense that the U.S. was incorrect about Soviet influence in Guatemala, but they also consider the cultural and ideological influences that warped Washington's view of the communist threat. Streeter, page 63. Post-revisionists focus more on how, though, the Eisenhower administration mistook a nationalist for a communist, even though, according to Streeter, they also focus on the, quote, strategic and economic factors. Streeter, page 62. Streeter basically says each of these views gets it wrong in one way or another. He goes on to cite a book, though, called Shattered Hope, and Shattered Hope, the Guatemalan Revolution and the United States, by Piero Gleasis, published by Princeton University Press. Gleasis goes down a path that none of the three others chose, finding Guatemalans who were close to Arbenz, such as his widow, and high-ranking members of the Communist Party, according to Streeter, page 67. Both said that while Arbenz was indeed influenced by the Marxist theory and practice, hence his land reform, he never joined the Communist Party. Gleasis says Moscow was not interested in aiding Guatemala. He also says United Fruit had a much smaller impact than what the revisionists have claimed, and that the issue of communism was of much higher concern than U.S. international corporate interests. Streeter, page 67. Streeter's interviews with the former leader of the Guatemalan Communist Party, Jose Manuel Fortuny, show a new side to the story, showing what the U.S. Americans thought about communists was true. The party just hadn't quite tied the knot with Arbenz. Gleasis' interviews revealed that the United States intelligence had accurately depicted the communist intentions. According to Jose Manuel Fortuny, the party believed that by administering Decree 900, that's Arbenz's land reform, through local committees, it would be laying, quote, the groundwork for the eventual radicalization of the peasantry, end quote. Streeter, page 68, Piero Gleasis, page 162. Streeter then takes a turn to Colother, Nicholas Colother, who, like I said, may not have said, worked for the CIA. Colother provided tons of useful inside information in his work, which includes his claim that Operation Success would, quote, combine psychological, economic, diplomatic, and paramilitary actions. Colother 1997, page 26 and 27. This is a quote from Colither, or from Streeter, and he just talks about Colither. Like the post-revisionist, Colither downplays the role of United Fruit and highlights security concerns. Indeed, it was the CIA rather than UFCO United Fruit that persuaded the State Department to pay attention to Guatemala. Agency analysts feared not that PGT was going to seize power immediately, the PGT, but that the land reform offered the communists an unprecedented opportunity to organize the masses. Colither, page 24 to 27 pages. Considering all of this, Colither joins many analysts in attributing the downfall of Arbenz to his army's lack of loyalty. Had the high command chosen to fight seriously, they could have easily crushed the Castillo Armas's ragtag band. Most military officers chose to abandon Arbenz, however, because they had grown weary of the ethnic conflict triggered by the land reform, and because they feared that thwarting PB's success would only invite a much larger U.S. military intervention. The transition between Arbenz and Castillo Armas represented, in reality, a military coup, not a man-based revolution against communism. Streeter, page 71. And in the footnotes is Jim Handy, Neil Pearson, Philip Taylor, Francisco Villagrain Kramer, and Suzanne Jonas. So what one can walk away from with is that financial interest may not have been the primary concern, but there certainly was a fear of communist values being spread across Latin America. And that, who do you think had that fear? The United States government, of course. I mean, yeah, I basically just left that out in the fucking transcript. United States was just all in dumbass fear about communism, and they think because one country didn't work great in the first 2 years, they think it's just terrible or something. Okay, enough about that. Basically, Streeter says that though there was a behind-the-scenes incentive to save United Fruit from nationalization, which was in agreement with Kinzer, there was basically a behind-the-scenes thing. It wasn't the U.S. government fearing, oh no, our GDP will go down. No, they're just afraid of communists. But there was, at least within United Fruit, a lot of fears about that. At the forefront of the plan, the agenda wasn't set because Arbenz was a repressive ruler. The United States needed to keep Guatemalan influence out of other Latin American countries, to keep national security in check, and to keep business flowing no matter how far down the chopping block it was. Quote, the U.S. officials understood that Guatemala's nationalist revolution was far more likely to spread by example than by force. One State Department individual warned in late 1953 that Guatemala threatened the stability of Honduras and El Salvador because its, quote, agrarian reform is a powerful propaganda weapon, and its broad social program of aiding the workers and the peasants in a victorious struggle against the upper classes and large foreign enterprises has a strong appeal to the population of Central American neighbors where similar conditions prevail. Streeter, page 68. Gliasis, page 365. Arbenz was at the very least a target, whose nature was distorted by the United States and their media alike. This is just the beginning, too, of a long campaign to uphold the U.S. influence in Latin America. This isn't a very unique thing. This has happened a whole bunch. There are a ton, if not nearly all, Latin American countries. almost all of them have experienced something similar to this. And it's not just similar because the conditions placed on by a different country were similar. It's the same country doing it over and over again. They've all experienced some imperialist crap coming from the US. And it's just kind of crazy that people don't even remember this. Plenty of living people were alive when this happened. I just don't understand how it's not something that's talked about. It just seems like it was all these things are completely either like downplayed or completely blacked out. And this is a part of a series of videos that I'll hope to, get together and finish, and maybe I'll talk about other stuff after that, but this is the first part. This is Guatemala. This is 1951 through like 1954. And this is just BS. This is our government doing this shit. Or at least to people in the United States, yeah, this is our shit. Like, yeah, it's just another fucking thing. Another fucking thing. And people are just fucking really happy about our government. Much more happy than they should be. Yeah, I'm done. Later.